Okay, welcome. We're continuing again tonight, going through my dissertation chapter by chapter before we get back into our normal everyday run of things. We've only got a couple, little bit more of these, and I'm not going to put some of the chapters together. I'm not going to go through glossaries or anything like that. You can read that on your own terms and time. So let's get looking at the origin, discussing some of this stuff. Gender equity, genesis, growth and development. Know, which is the origin of Gnostic, etc. Good, evil, human journey, and all of the rest. So I presume that everyone's done their reading and done all their bits and pieces that they needed to do. So, of course, there are also alternative versions of all of this stuff. If you think about it for a moment, the horror industry, I had the displeasure and misfortune of watching a really bad movie about Lilith on the plane, or at least getting half an hour in before I had to turn the damn thing off. Lilith being sort of a Judaic argument of before Eve, there was another woman who got spurned, and that's why we have an even number of ribs. There you go. It's one argument, I guess, but it's not a terribly good one. So either way, we're looking at woman as an interpretation of sort of humanity, mankind, and etymologically speaking, woman is derivative of man. So Wu man is from man, goes back into combination of Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian, and others. Man is related to the term to think. So humanity is really about rationality. Man in the street is average, but woman walking in the street, street walker. I know it's our etymology of words is a little bit warped, but that's our history, Western philosophy, psychology, etc. Many of these aspects of where we are came about because of strength more than anything else. If you think about it for a moment, in early society, we naturally, of course, gravitated to certain areas. Although there are strong women, the majority of women aren't as strong as the majority of men. And while you can actually say there are women who are stronger than some men and men who are weaker and all that stuff, the reality is it's going to always be the average. And thinking about what we used to do, well, plowing a field, who gravitates towards that? The stronger members of society. This is, of course, before animals. Then alternatively, we have battle, fighting, defending. So while there are examples of female warriors, they were generally isolated. Even in Viking communities, etc., quite often women, if they were barren or already had children, but yeah, it's not everything. We have the philosophy of Simone Beauvoir, introduced some of these concepts in the second sex. I don't know, any of you read this at all? No one? No. Typical 20th century postmodern existentialist philosopher. She does have some good points. Unfortunately, like many of the 20th century existentialists, took it far too far. And looking at all of this, of course, we come into the concepts of where we need to start thinking about humanity as a whole. I mean, I don't know, some of the ways we do it now seem to go too far and treat everyone as a homogenized mash, which is always the way these things seem to go. They go a little bit too far and then a little bit back, and things push back. So now, getting into concepts of gender equity. Strangely enough, this is actually part of what I did. as I said, woman is wife man. It's a relation to the man. And we covered some of this in our early lectures on Greco-Roman philosophy. If you remember, we covered the idea of how there was one being in Greek religion, and then we were divided by the gods. And that one being, of course, was androgynous, with both man and woman. And some of these ideas are still represented within our society. We also see the other traits like masculinity with leadership and strength. But again, some of this comes from the concept of defending, fighting, etc. As a woman, if your job is raising children, which fairly much that was your job for most of history, not because you weren't able to do other things, but because just the sort of specialization and division of roles meant that you didn't have any time for anything else. Now, in understanding this, we forget the difficulty of just doing housework, etc., in the past, and why we had societies where men and women had roles, either the house or out working, etc., which even in reality, there was usually an overlap. So as an example, even 100 years ago, just like 1920s, etc., the amount of time to do housework, to prepare food, etc., was estimated to be about 60 hours a week. So if you start thinking about this for a moment, if a man is out there working 60 to 80 hours a week, which was actually fairly normal, then just feeding and doing anything else would be in the order of a full-time job for the woman. So there wasn't really an opportunity to go out and do other things. And for most people uneducated, the foundation here, of course, was the man was stronger. He could thus go out and work, labor, etc. So we see this right back in the early development of many aspects of the church as well, especially as the collapse of Rome happened. As the collapse of Rome happened and we moved back into small autonomous groups, then we moved away from a protected society where some women were starting to have some rights, into one where we're moving back into isolated agrarian communities protected by small isolated feudal groups. And the reality here was that evolved because bandits and the difficulty of living. So again, language shapes our perceptions. We have titles such as policeman, fireman, etc. And those are changing because, well, the history and nature of gender bias over time. So what we always forget, and of course, it's because most of us haven't experienced or read the past, but also because we haven't lived it, is the nature of society changes over centuries and very deeply. So getting back to Genesis, we have Yahweh, of course, creator of the universe. They're completing it in 6 days with all the contrasting elements. There's actually some differences in Genesis, and I'll leave this for you to have a bit of a read. The initial biblical story of Genesis and later parts of Genesis aren't actually quite the same. Now, this is an interesting thing that most people don't pick up on, but there are conflicting and contrasting Genesis stories within Genesis. So it's not just the one that everyone reads, but there are actually in the Bible, in Genesis, very different aspects of how Adam and Eve were sort of grew up. Now, again, I've noted before, Adam and Eve were banished from paradise. The reason, of course, eating from the tree of good or evil, but the alternative view of that, which I personally subscribe to, is that it's a learning and growth sort of narrative. And you could say that it's hard love. Now, I was talking to my wife well, just yesterday, actually, when I returned. And one of the things we were talking about is how we look back at things, for instance, children. And not only, I don't know, but as a woman, I've been, like my wife's told me that you forget the hardship and pain of childbirth and you move on from it. But even young children and the stress of raising a family, which even as a male I can talk about, strangely enough, you go through and you forget these things as the children get older. So you look back and you see the benefits and the joy, and you actually forget all the negatives. And the same story can be probably put into a larger view of this. So in creating the binary opposites, the narrative also goes into man, woman, yin, yang. And we have a gender binary here again with Adam needing a companion, which really many of these aspects go into, of course, the gender norms that have perpetrated through society. The being banished is interesting. Eden teaches a moral lesson, but at the same time, we have a choice. So Adam doesn't just get banished. Adam is actually choosing. So some of our pictures depict Adam through history in different ways. The one that I have in this slide is rather Rubenesque in a way. Adam's a bit, well, normal everyday male rather than being particularly strong. But innocence is thus not only lost, but in the development of wisdom. So as we lose wisdom, as we lose innocence, we develop wisdom. And this itself has an interesting sort of connotation as we think about people who are happy, people who are open to change, people who are more intelligent, less intelligent, etc. So our cosmological and moral framework, as it gets in there, really has shaped our philosophical growth. Now, of course, we have the being cast out, sometimes a flaming sword, which was left to guard the gates. Other times we have the basis of our law, morals, views, etc. So one aspect of all of this, of course, is also the development of law. Once God sort of cast them out, we have the creation of a society, but they only have that because of eating from the tree. The tree of knowledge also gives them knowledge of law, of what is right and wrong, and thus the ability to start, well, deciding which things they should and should not do. It's quite interesting in that many different philosophers have taken up this. Heidegger, for instance, Nietzsche in different ways, but I won't do that one in any detail here. But eventually we have after I get through this, we'll get to some lectures on Nietzsche. Now, the fall is not only the cause of all evil, including death, pain, in the world as a result of original sin, but knowledge of it. So one way of actually looking at this is it's possible that things could have happened, but as with animals, we don't know. So therefore, it's not the same sort of evil. We don't consider the lion to be evil because it's, well, gorged itself. So it's still not something that we want. It's not a good. If it happens to you, you might consider it an evil, but it's not generally that. So mortality here is being towards death, and also realizing our mortality, which introduces a very stoic way of thinking if we actually consider this, in that one of the main sort of premises from Seneca is we're all going to die. And that sounds horrible to some people to sit there, especially if you live in Silicon Valley. If you're a Jack Dorsey and a Silicon Valley type, then your whole purpose for being is to find a way not to die. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, there isn't one. There is no uploading ourselves. We're not going to have it at all. I don't believe it, not only in my lifetime, I don't believe we will ever upload. But hey, we can think of ourselves as binary, but I don't believe we are. So the fall helped cause a shift in how we perceive. So the struggle between free will and divine commandment changed. And again, now we don't have divine commandment anymore. What we have is choice. And sometimes these things are good for us and sometimes they're bad. So all of us, of course, have choice. We face that every day. I mean, it's whether we end up doing what we should or something else. As an example, I, with some other people that I know, do intermittent fasting. So today, other than coffee, which I don't consider, I'm having water and lots of it. And there's always that drive to want more. I mean, by the end of the day, it's actually sometimes better than at the beginning, ironically. But these are, again, choices. It's a choice to endure. I mean, it's a form of suffering. Going without food is that. But sometimes we choose that, and developing responsibility, virtue, and what we are, it becomes a path towards growth and development, allowing us to not only find ourselves, but better ourselves. So the Bible stresses hard work in many areas. Like all texts that are based in a lot of allegory, then we have, well, the importance of hard work and action, but how we read that, of course, is taken by different people in different ways. I don't see the just give money to anyone bit that some people seem to. The Bible in many places says that it's not good to beg when you're able to work. That doesn't mean that there's no charity, because able to work is very different. For instance, if someone's in their 90s, injured, unable to, that's very different to someone who you see on our streets, sometimes overweight and yet begging for food. It's we have to think, just because someone wants not to work doesn't mean they have a right. So the Bible actually stresses the importance of that, and our job here is to labor. So as we move from in a shift from paradise to a world of labor, we have a need to develop more. And I've said this one as well. There's a difference between labor and work. Labor is that repetitive stuff that we keep doing. Alternatively, the sort of other side of this is work, where we use our mind, our rational thought, to reduce the amount of labor that we need to do. And that's a good thing. It doesn't mean we don't stop working. It means we stop the mundane and the repetitive. So think for a moment. The world, even just 100 years ago, was far more steeped in labor for the majority of people. Very few people on this world would have been able to have the time, the ability to learn to do things. Now we have the opposite, where we're trying to force 75% of the population to complete university, which is probably a bad thing, but I don't think 75% of people can actually do what's needed in that sort of learning personally. But yeah, anyway. So man, we've covered this before. Adam, created by the divine potter out of clay. And there's a shortcoming. Self-assertion. It's the youth and the lack of wisdom as we're growing. But equally, I don't think it can be held against us, because before the development of wisdom, of course, we don't have the ability to, well, know that we're doing wrong. So the interesting part is the choice, in my opinion, by Adam. So if Eve has eaten the apple for whatever reason, thought, being seduced, lied to, etc., now Adam still doesn't fully understand, but he still chooses to eat with her. Now, that in itself has some interesting connotations. I mean, did Adam actually do something virtuous if he doesn't know what is wrong? And I think this is a key aspect. If you don't know, you don't understand, can it actually be virtuous? So they lived in a garden with plenty of food. They had the tempting tree, good and evil, and they don't really know about death and suffering. We have a flawed driving force of humanity, and we have a connection to the natural world. So remember, the forbidden tree itself grew from the very same soil that Adam had. Now, this became very clear once it happened. So the explicit instruction is there. You're free to eat from any tree except from the tree of knowledge, lest they face death. But here's the next thing. If you have no knowledge of it, what sort of threat is that in itself? So before eating of the tree of knowledge, even the knowledge of death was not there. If you live in a realm where the tree of life means that effectively you can live forever, where you don't die, where you have no knowledge of hardship, telling someone who has never faced death that they're going to die, it's like, how many people have tried to explain death to a 3-year-old? Not many of us are really going to get too far on that one. I mean, I've spoken about these things to a 3-year-old when someone's died, and then of course you get a little bit later. So when are they coming back?
Yeah, when our dog died, we explained to our son the dog has died. We're burying the dog, and the next day he asked us, can we go and dig the dog back up now because I miss the dog. Sorry, son. Yeah, that's not going to happen. Yeah. So yeah,
not unless you go to
totally.
pet cemetery, but then you probably don't want that dog back.
No, not really.
So part of all of this is accepting trials represented through all of the process of change. And if we actually start thinking about the alternative, the idea of eternal life is in some ways perverse without wisdom. So let's imagine now that we have this concept of being able to upload ourselves. We won't be ourselves. We won't be human anymore. If we start thinking about it for a moment, if you're not going to die, let's go back to the ring of Gyges. Of course, that ring was very different. It made you invisible, offered a different power. But now this is, again, fairly much a unbounded power Imagine now that you have no cost, no death, no nothing else. We already see in some of these meta type things the sort of second life in the old days. People exceed bounds, and there are already cases that have been interesting because we don't know what to do with. People have argued, if someone sexually abuses my avatar, what do I do? Which is one thing when it's a avatar, but what if it's you? What now? Where do the boundaries happen? Where, if you're immortal, being locked away for 100 years out of eternity, really, does it matter so much anymore? We saw one of Charles Manson's accomplices released just the other day. In time, does that matter if you're truly immortal? Does no economic cost change how we are, and does it leave us as humans? So in contemplating this process with nothing but unbounded, it's not really going to be an us. It's not a humanity. So I know that many people look at this and they see the concept of, wouldn't it be nice if, but none of us are really ready. I mean, it's a very simple thing to put, but I don't think any of us would survive ourselves, our soul, our core, that sort of power. And it is a power. The ability to know that you're not going to die, that you have no limits, no constraints, doesn't just mean that suddenly we go out there and start creating wonderful things. If you're not like me and study every moment, why would you suddenly do it? If you don't learn all the time, why would you go, oh, I can live forever, now I'm going to pick up a book? I think actually it would be the opposite. I'm going to live forever, I can leave that till tomorrow. It's probably less likely that anything would ever seem imperative. Why would anyone collaborate? Why would we form companies and groups or anything? If you now can create anything you want, why? So without some form of economic cost, hierarchy, etc., then we don't have a reason. So the transition to death is also, ironically, one of personal growth and development. So right now, fear of death is a motivating factor in many people's lives. It means that they embrace personal growth. They try and find things to do. They have families. They push themselves to achieve. So the interesting downside to immortality is, what will we ever do ever again other than be bored? And it's going to be, I mean, I don't know about you, but I find things like Netflix and TV boring very quickly. So
I was just going to say that there's almost an infinity catalog of crappy content out there.
Yep. And it gets bigger every day. Hence why they're probably, I mean, when I was in America, I flick through and have a look what's on some of the things in the hotel every now and again. And Seinfeld's still playing. Friends is still playing. My daughter watches Friends for some reason. I didn't like it when it first came out, so I don't know what people do now, but that's me. So getting back to Genesis, we have a rich account of our human origins, the sort of creation, fall, and redemption themes. Eve has been a little bit maligned in the same way as Pandora. But in each of these stories, and Pandora is very similar as well, we have a story of growth, overcoming obstacles, learning to navigate life. So if we think now to Pandora, for instance, if we remember some of these stories, the idea here is fire, which given, of course, by Prometheus, is the idea of technology and gaining wisdom as well. So in both stories, we have the woman involved, but the woman is not only involved in what is negative, but positive. At the same time, the sort of negative aspect of what's occurred has made us who we are. It has allowed us to evolve, to cultivate ourselves and strive to be more. It is the self-discovery process that allows us to look into ourselves and find what we should be. So it's really the idea of becoming. And in some of the early alternative versions of Christianity, like the Gnostic, the idea here of gnosis was taking this even further. It's the sort of secret knowledge within ourselves. I'm not Gnostic, by the way, but I find some of the ideas interesting, and where people take things when they keep running with them too deeply. So self-consciousness is also part of what we are, not necessarily what I'd say in a Freudian way, but know, and as it says there, to know, to be, to declare, to assert. So saying what I am, the word. And it basically opens up the development of rationality for us. It's the ability now to have the reflected life. So who remembers Plato? What was Plato's idea of a good life? From my early lectures.
I'm trying to remember. It was, correct me if I'm wrong, Brendan should know this anyway. He's unmuted himself, so okay, over to you, Brendan.
Well, I was going to say I'm trying to remember, but it was essentially, a life where you could look back and at your accomplishments, and it wasn't that happiness doesn't come to you all the time during life, but it's at the end when you look back on your life that you have created and are satisfied with how it went and what you built.
So the life worth living is one of reflection and introspection. And by investigating and rationally looking into ourselves, that's where we find what Plato at least would call the good life. And the distinction here is from pleasure versus actual happiness. And we seem to forget these terminologies now. So
just to interrupt 2 seconds, Tom wanted to give a little bit of input, his thoughts as well. Tom?
Oh, yeah, no, I was just in response to that question. I mean, it was just about it was about doing good, right? I mean, it was about doing what fulfills your soul and what you feel good about.
Which is a very good sort of way of putting it. Now, as an example of this, moral selfishness, which was a concept by Ayn Rand. Now, if you think about it, people sit there going, selfish, that's bad. But how can we actually give to others if we don't give to ourselves? So the idea is not that that selfishness is wrong. It's the difference between selfish and self-centered. And thinking about it for a moment, why do you do something? Why do you do it? Because if you're going to be honest with yourself, it is something that you, for whatever virtue, for reason, for anything else, the reason behind why you do it might be important, but we're always selfish. Even those who claim to be altruistic, they're doing it because they wish to have a feeling that they've done good, that they want to be seen doing good. Sometimes it's people wanting to be seen doing something and being seen to be altruistic, which is still sort of self-centered. But sometimes it's just that feeling you get yourself from doing something, which makes you feel good. So looking at this, of course, the concept here is, again, work versus labor. And as we move from labor into work, we do good for other people, not because we're taking or exploiting them, but rather because when we build something that makes our life easier, it leads to other people's lives being easier too. So despite the Marxian BS, the capitalist world continues to grow and develop, unfortunately at a slower rate than it should, because we've got too much socialism thrown in, because people thought that everything would have imploded by now. And the irony there is there's a big difference between what people understand in, of course, capitalism versus mercantilism versus just pure sort of Wall Street villain sort of speculation and cronyism. And they're not the same. And people, unfortunately, have been taught that capitalism is about not developing or not building, but rather how much you can take. But if you think about it, the concept of capitalism is an entrepreneur has an idea, a capitalist invests money. And that has nothing to do with the concept of how do I extract value out of the market at all. I mean, yes, speculation's fine, but it isn't necessarily the capitalist idea that people seem to think it is. Okay, so good and evil. Again, hard topics, hard concepts. And by reaching our full potential, we can start to navigate the extremes of thought. We can now build part of our journey and personal growth, resilience, and a quest for understanding. So there's a paradox here, and there's some contradictions, not only between the various sort of biblical creation stories, but the desire to know good and evil as it relates to us developing and possessing knowledge against being told not to. But then sometimes if you want a child to do something, you tell them not to, and create a forbidden fruit, and I guarantee that they will. So same thing here. So behold, man has become one of us, knowing good and evil. I mean, that's a change if you think about it for a moment. Behold, man has become one of us. We've evolved, we're more. So in our self-assertion, the sin of knowing is really the urge to measure ourselves against the gods. Now, who remembers I introduced a concept in the past called hubris? Remember what hubris is?
Over self-confidence.
In a part, yes, but it actually goes into a desire to measure ourselves and compare ourselves to the gods in the Greek. So whenever we had some of our Greco-Roman, or mainly Greek, characters deciding that they would sort of have a bit of a waving exercise with the gods, and like they would learn, well, they get smacked down. So look at Theseus, he goes through an occasional Euripides. Remember Euripides? Nice fun sort of journey into well, being smacked down.
Wasn't he the one who journeyed to hell in Hades? And am I thinking of the right one? And then he messed up and yeah, suffered for it.
Euripides, well, no, well, although he was in some of the stories later in Hades, he was the wonderful guy who managed to marry his mother.
All right.
Orpheus and the underworld there with his lyre and everything like that, had to look back and do the pillar of salt bit, which also happens to be a story similar in the Bible. There are lots of sort of cross-pollination of ideas between these works. But anyway, we have a lot of hubris, and it's one of the big problems that people have noted. So really thinking too much of ourselves and going beyond what we are. It's a lack of, I mean, it's not just pride. In pride, there is, I mean, people say sin, but there are two types of pride. There is a justified pride and there's an unjustified pride. And the sin is really the unjustified one, the hubris, the thinking too much when we can't, and going too far. It's okay to be proud of your children who have just well, graduated or something like this, or knowing that you've worked hard and done a good job, but then running around and bragging about it and saying that you're better than everyone else and that sort of stuff, and going to the extreme in a Greek sense and challenging the gods, going, hey, I can do this better than you. That's, of course, going too far. Now, we partake of the forbidden fruit. We learn, we become rational, we become like one of us, as it says. And that actually means that we start changing and altering. We're no longer part of nature. Ironically, many of us don't seem to understand this, and we think, oh, we're just animals. Well, no. I know the Richard Dawkins of the world want to just make us think that we are no more than animals, and every time we say these things, we'll find something else that an animal does. But I'm sorry, it's not just a qualitative or quantitative difference in that. We are very different. And no matter how much you try and ascribe and anthropomorphize animals, we're different. Well, at least some of us are. There are times when I wonder about some people, but that idea of rationality, the ability to create, develop, etc. I mean, you can say that there are simple tool making capabilities, like chimpanzees can use straws to pull out termites and things like this, but it's not quite the same. We're not actually creating, animals aren't creating knowledge in the same way, and they're not rationally thinking in the same way. I know people love to debate that one and say, oh, actually, it's just a different level. No, they're not. Not even slightly. They're not going across generations. They're not actually changing their environment. No matter how long we think about it, it's us who actually have reshaped nature. And yes, you can argue that the existence of animals and plants and everything like that does change the very place they are, but not consciously. And that's the difference. Even though we screw things up, because lots of us have different ideas and don't get along, the big distinction here is we actively try and change. So now, our human journey. We have a, well, long interaction of thinking about all of this. We have the choice of human autonomy. Do we actually make choices? Do we not? And we can go into the philosophy of all of this, where we sit there wondering, do we actually really choose, or is it chosen for us, based on the sort of measurement of when choices were made? Now, the argument here is part of our mind that understands this. We will sit there and go, actually, this part of our brain made a choice, and then it went out to our consciousness that said, now, yes, and I'm making a story around it, but still all of us. And as much as you want to be the sort of not separate, it's all just a mechanistic process in our mind, anti-philosopher type cognitive scientist, then you have to still go back and think, well, yes, it's still your brain making that choice, and just know we don't understand how we explain it to ourselves afterwards, but there's a deeper than language part of us making that choice. So, I mean, from a philosophical point of view, we could even chuck in the soul being a dichotomy still, even with that, if we actually explained it. Descartesian type duality can still be there. Not that I subscribe to that necessarily in that way, but I mean, if you think about it, us as a video game character and the real us being a brain in a box moving it would still lead to that sort of gap of what exists. So I'm not saying that that's actually what there is, but I mean, there are many ways of describing it, and just saying, haha, you're wrong. It hasn't actually closed the gap at all. The idea that we're sorry, the gaps have got smaller because science has closed them all, like talking to try and tell you. No, for every gap science closes, it opens up 10 more. So the reality is we just change what our gaps are and we have no idea. So we, again, can look at this as, well, parents and children. We learn from experience. We hopefully have a world where it's not too hard. For some children, harder than others. In the West, even majority of places like China, etc. now, if you're in the right area, life's not as difficult as it used to be. I'm old enough that when I grew up, people were starving everywhere. The majority of the world's population was still starving. Now, there are people starving, but it's generally because of warfare, because of human-induced problems that it happens, not because of too many of us trying to share the same goods. So we allow our children to endure hardships because, not because we're cruel, but because we want them to grow. Well, at least when I was doing this, that seemed to be the way. Now we seem to have this idea that children should get everything and not suffer at all, and no one should ever have any problems. And there we got a screwed up generation. What can I say? And I'll say that quite frankly. I mean, it's where it's going. All right. So as we learn and we grow, we have sort of the whole concept of development. So questions, reflections. To comprehend work, we must think about how we challenge ourselves. Now, remember the distinction here between work and labor as well. So to understand something, to make it better, means we actually sit there and pull it apart, and we create a challenge that sometimes is more effort in the beginning, so that we have less later. I mean, and this is something that people find strange. When I was younger, I used to call myself a lazy programmer because I would basically code up bits, whatever I was doing as a job, so that I didn't need to do them again. I set up cron jobs to run all the things I was meant to be doing. And the more I did that, the more extra things I got. Now, good and bad to it. It meant, no, I didn't suddenly have extra time, because as soon as I had free time, someone would find something else for me to do. But equally, I wasn't doing the same thing day in, day out, as some people had done prior to me. And I don't know about you, but sitting there reading through the same log files every damn day is horrible. I would rather filter out all the bits that I don't need to and take the exceptions. So as we learn, we comprehend ourselves better, and we start going into creating new ideas. don't have any references in there, but it's in the paper itself.